Everybody doing? Hope you're having a fantastic day. It is Wednesday, May 6th. And tonight I wanted to discuss with you guys a topic that I think is one of the topics in theology that is most fraught with equivocation, with misunderstanding. And it can be very easy if you don't start from a systematic understanding of the topic. It can be very easy to fall prey to a lot of Protestant rhetoric against Catholic teaching on these points. And this topic is the topic of concupiscence, because really, concupiscence is an ill defined term. It's a term where, when we discuss theological topics and the issue of concupiscence, or is concupiscence a sin, or a lot of these different questions related to concupiscence, basically everybody defines the term kind of how they feel like it, or really everyone kind of defines the term based on whatever their vibes are telling them when they hear the word concupiscence or they see it described for the first time. But in theology, when we have this discussion over concupiscence and the sinfulness of concupiscence, you have to remember that we are talking about something very, very precise. And once you actually explain the definition of the term concupiscence, the moral value of concupiscence, the different divisions or distinctions between different types of concupiscence, once we actually have a systematic understanding of concupiscence, we're actually going to be able to understand the doctrine and understand how the Catholic teaching on this point, especially the teaching of St. Thomas Aquinas on this point, is actually very clear. It's actually something which fits in a lot of puzzle pieces with different points of theology that you might know about. And when it comes to this topic, there's nothing, and I emphasize this in the beginning, there's nothing so important as starting with some good divisions and some good definitions of terms. Because if you don't start with that, and you just start trying to read willy-nilly into this without actually thinking about the meaning of the terms that you use, you're going to really fall into a lot of trouble here, and you're going to fall into various errors, sometimes errors against the faith, sometimes just, silly mistakes that are going to actually, especially when it comes to the issue of concupiscence, it's going to be something that is going to really affect the way you think about the spiritual life, the way you think about your relationship to God, the necessity of repentance, a lot of different issues, because the doctrine of concupiscence, and this is kind of an important historical point to bring up from the beginning, the doctrine of concupiscence was explicitly formed as as a sort of related dispute within the dispute around original sin. And the reason that it arose on this point was during the Pelagian crisis, there were certain authors who did not adequately understand the corruption that is passed down from Adam, the corruption that's passed down to his children. And really, a lot of this ended up taking a spiritual form. One of, in my mind, the best spiritual works written in the history of the church on continence by St. Augustine is actually kind of an extended application of the doctrine of concupiscence to the spiritual life. A lot of the later controversies in the 420s that took place near the end of the life of St. Augustine with Julian was actually over this doctrine of concupiscence, and specifically actually how concupiscence relates to our teaching on marriage and the morality of certain acts surrounding marriage, right? So when it comes to the doctrine of concupiscence, it is very important. It's foundational when we're talking about the doctrine on original sin, or the doctrine on baptism. We're talking about the spiritual doctrine of the church. When we're talking about the teaching on marriage and how we view marriage, how we view heaven, the resurrection of the body, the beatific vision, the mercy of God, right, the justice of God. A lot of these different doctrines are actually going to resolve into very important questions surrounding the doctrine of concupiscence. So since it is something which is so fraught with errors from the beginning, I kind of wanted to start with a simple but precise definition of exactly when Catholic authors talk about concupiscence, what is actually meant by it. Because in the broadest possible sense, we can even talk about something like the love of concupiscence, right? The love of concupiscence is something which is not necessarily going to be something which is immoral, right? It's something which is a delight in possessing something. So obviously you can have a delight in possessing God, right? So that's obviously not the sense in which, when we talk about a very negative way of speaking about concupiscence, we're obviously not talking about simply the delight that we have in something. Rather specifically, when we're talking about concupiscence, we mean those motions of the soul, and this is actual concupiscence, but we talk about habitual concupiscence as well. Those motions of the soul towards sensible delights or towards sensible pleasures. So, obviously, in this way, if we just talk about the most general sense, right, the motions of the soul towards sensible delights, this isn't something that's going to have really a moral character, right? Because sensible delights, this is something which these motions of the soul can go towards a good object, they can go towards a bad object, they can go towards an indifferent object, right? These are motions of the lower faculties. These are not motions yet. We're not talking about the relationship between the will and these motions of sensible delight. So, for example, we could talk about a motion of concupiscence towards water. You know, if you're really thirsty and you want to drink water, and then you drink water and you have enjoyment in the cold water that you're drinking, in the broadest possible sense, this is a motion of concupiscence towards water, right? So when we get into this idea of concupiscence and the sinfulness of concupiscence and whatever else, the divisions between various different types of concupiscence, we're really going to distinguish between multiple different types of motion. That's going to be very, very helpful for understanding this doctrine. So we distinguish between second motions, second first motions, and first motions. Okay. So these are three different types of motions of concupiscence. They're all called concupiscence. They're all called motions of sensuality, if you kind of want to put it like that. They're all called concupiscence, but obviously, once we get into how these terms are defined, it's going to be pretty obvious that the moral character, the moral value of each of these is going to differ. So we're going to need to investigate this a lot more closely than just having, pre-baked formulas of concupiscence isn't sinful or saying, concupiscence is sinful or whatever else. We need to actually have a little bit more precision when we're talking about this problem. So the first motion, these are also sometimes called natural motions, or amongst church fathers, it's sometimes called blameless passions, especially when we talk about Christology. These first motions, these are basically going to be solely biological realities. So, for example, hunger and thirst. We don't have any sort of control of the will. These don't enter the moral sphere. You can't really control these motions. You have a motion towards water when you're thirsty. You have a motion towards food when you're hungry. These biological realities, they don't at all enter into this direct sphere of the will, right? You can't just will really hard yourself not to be hungry or will really hard yourself not to be thirsty or anything like that. So these first motions or natural motions that come from a mere sort of biological reality, these merely come from the way in which our body is constituted. These obviously, and even the Reformed are going to agree with us on this, these first motions are obviously not at all sinful in any sense, okay? But then we have second motions, and second motions are those motions of the will, sometimes called consequent passions. These motions of the will are going to be motions of the passions are going to be motions of the passions that are directed and ordered by the will. So obviously we also can't give a universal judgment on these either, right? Because if you have a motion of the passion that is directed by the will towards a good sensible object or towards a reasonable sensible object, this isn't going to be something that is just automatically sinful, right? If you have, let's say you have an act of the will that directs the hand. The hand's an irrational agent, part of the body. If you direct the hand towards helping somebody, then obviously your hand is participating in that good character of the will which has ordered it towards a good end. But if you use your hand to kill somebody, unjustly, that is, if you use your hand to kill somebody unjustly, then obviously your hand is used as an instrument of the will towards an evil end. So when it comes to these second motions, these consequent passions, these second motions and consequent passions that are directed and ordered directly by the will, these things, they're going to take upon themselves the character of the will's action. So these can be mortal sins, these can be venial sins, these can be meritorious, these can be acts of natural justice, right? There's nothing stopping it. Whatever the will can extend to, the will can use the passions to extend to as well. Although obviously this is something which is under the influence of the will. But these two right there, the first motions that are sort of just natural motions and don't enter into the caveat of the moral sphere, doesn't enter into the will, whatever. These are going to obviously not be what we're talking about when it comes to concupiscence, in the sinfulness of concupiscence. Second motions, kind of. I mean, in a way, we're talking about these when it comes to concupiscence, but not really. I mean, it's not really going to be these second motions that are the super controversial ones. Everybody is going to agree that if you order your passions to an evil end, then it's going to be evil. And that if you order your passions to a good end, then it's going to be good. So, for example, when it comes to Christ, when it comes to Adam, Christ and Adam, they had both of these types of passions. They had both of these blameless passions, these first motions, natural motions, whatever you want to call them. They had these motions, and then they also had these second motions, right, that are ordered and directed by the will. But then we have an interesting category between these two. These are sometimes called second first motions or motions of sensuality. And this is going to be where a lot of the controversy is when it comes to these. Sometimes these are just called first motions of sensuality. Sometimes these are simply called motions of concupiscence or actual concupiscence or whatever else. And really what this is going to come from is these are going to be those motions that happen in the soul, in those lower faculties, in the sensible appetites. These are going to be motions of the appetites towards sensible goods, which the will in principle can control, right? So we have all of these motions of the soul that the will can in principle control. And there's the question, okay, if the will can in principle control these motions of the soul, these motions of concupiscence, these second first motions, does this enter in the moral sphere? Can we talk about sin or merit or whatever else being in these second first motions? Because man was not created with these second first motions, with these inordinate passions, these inordinate motions, right? Man was not created with these. Adam, he had control over all of his passions. There were not even passions that were said to be praeter legem, or beside the law. The passions that he had were all directed by reason. So they were reasonable. They were ordered towards their proper ends, right? The higher faculties were ordered to God. The lower faculties were ordered to the higher faculties. And there was a sort of command and order which was preserved initially in man. So when it comes to Adam, he didn't have these. Rather, these are an effect of original sin. Original sin caused us to lose this primordial order between the various faculties of our soul. We lost this order, and because we lost this order, now in the words of St. Paul, the flesh lusts against the spirit, and the spirit lusts against the flesh. We have some sort of disorder, we have some sort of, we have all these motions within us towards these sensible objects that are disordered, these disordered motions that are against how we ought to act. And there's the question, okay, if we have these motions, is there a way in which we can talk about these motions being sinful? And the answer that St. Thomas gives is probably quite surprising to you. What St. Thomas says is that St. Thomas says that it is a command of the law, thou shalt not covet. And this is something that St. Augustine, he brings up again and again and again. We have this command of the law that says, thou shalt not covet. And our faculties, our higher faculties, are able to restrain the lower faculties in individual motions to frustrate them, right? We're able to, in one sense, you can consent to these motions, and obviously consenting to an inordinate motion is very bad, and this is going to be sinful to the degree in which the motion is disordered, and all of those other conditions. You have consenting to the motions. You have simply ignoring the motions, right? You have just permitting them, or at least, having a sort of negative relationship to them of not actually stopping them. Then you have vigilantly stopping them. You have, overpowering them, the spirit lusting against the flesh, right? In that way, we are by grace, overcoming these passions, and we are mortifying the flesh so that these inordinate passions are stopped. And since we have this command, what St. Thomas says, since we have this command to actually overcome these passions, and since we have at least the physical ability to overcome these passions individually, what he says is that if you fail in this precept, if you fail to actually overcome those passions, those second first motions, motions of sensuality, motions of concupiscence that are in the moral order, if you fail to do this, then you are sinning. And this is quite surprising, right? Because when you have this motion of anger, let's say, that arises, motion of lust, and you mortify the flesh, you overcome it, you stop it right in its tracks, and you're able to destroy this and stop this, like is possible by grace, in the baptized. If in the regenerate you're able to do that, then this is a meritorious act, right? This is something that certain enemies of the church were actually condemned for, is saying that if you have this motion and you overcome it and stop it, that this is not a meritorious act. This is actually something which is still sinful. So if you have that right there, right, you overcome the motion of concupiscence, then that is a merit. You've done a meritorious action because it's within the moral order, right? And a lot of the enemies of this doctrine, certain Catholics even, who are enemies of this doctrine, that second first motions that are, not mortified, that these are somehow not sinful. This is what these people will say. How would we have merit? How would we have merit in this case if we weren't overcoming something which was inordinate? If we weren't making an act that was in the moral sphere? It doesn't even make sense. So if we permit this motion, or if we are somehow lazy, or we are, not adequately vigilant over our faculties so as to overcome this motion, then we are sinning. This motion of concupiscence in that way is a sin. Now, what kind of sin is it? Because obviously with the second motions that we talked about, it's quite easy, right? Or even consenting to these motions, it's quite easy to actually just, okay, we can apply the principles of Catholic moral theology and the distinction between mortal and venial sin and imperfections and whatever, and we can actually look and see how these play out, right? We can look and see and divide and distinguish upon the basis of those, of those different principles. It's not that hard to actually do this. But when it comes to these motions of concupiscence, these second first motions, motions of sensuality, whichever way you kind of want to cut it, whichever way you want to speak about this, we have this question, okay, how sinful are these? Are these mortally sinful? Are these venially sinful? And this is something that was at one time disputed among Catholic theologians. Some would say that these are merely venially sinful in the baptized, but maybe in the unbaptized, they are mortally sinful, right? This was a dispute that was going on. But what St. Thomas says is he gives a pretty simple answer. He says, well, when it comes to the God is not a respecter of persons. When it comes to the unbaptized and the baptized, he is not going to judge one more harshly than the other when it comes to the moral quality of the act. If it's a mortal sin and it's forgiven, then it's a mortal sin and it's forgiven. If it's a venial sin and unforgiven, it's a venial sin and unforgiven. But ultimately, that is still a mortal sin, that is still a venial sin. So when it comes to these acts, these, according to St. Thomas, they are only venially sinful for a very important reason. And the important reason for this is to think about what is actually the extent of the sensible faculties. Because when we talk about mortal sin is the aversion from God. There's two aspects to it: the aversion from God and the attachment to creatures. So we have removed ourselves from our last end. But when it comes to venial sins are simply inordinate attachments to created goods. It doesn't require that we actually turn away from our last end. So if we're keeping those definitions in mind of mortal and venial sin, it's actually pretty easy to answer this question. It's very, very easy to answer this question Because how far can the sensible faculties go? Well, the sensible faculties are not like the higher faculties of the intellect and will that can actually contemplate the end and that can actually turn us away from our end. Rather, the sensible faculties, they're only proportioned to sensible goods. So they can only draw us to created goods. They don't have in their scope the ability to have some sort of formal aversion to God, right? That's not possible when it comes to these motions of concupiscence. So what St. Thomas says is that when it comes to these motions, they can only bring about this inordinate attachment to creatures. They can't bring about this formal aversion from God. Therefore, when it comes to these second first motions of sensuality, these motions of concupiscence, they're only going to be able to be venial sins. They're not going to be able to be mortal sins. And this leads us actually to an interesting discussion because St. Thomas, he brings up the question, I kind of mentioned it earlier, this question of whether concupiscence, and by this we can mean habitual concupiscence, or we can mean acts of concupiscence, or we can really mean a lot of different things, whether concupiscence in the baptized or in the regenerate is as sinful or is mortally sinful, or whether in the unbaptized, in the infidel, they are mortally sinful. Like, is there a way in which we talk about these as being mortally sinful? And here we need to be really careful because I just defined mortal sin in a certain way, right? Which is the formal aversion from God as a last end, which is going to somehow necessarily exclude us from the beatific vision. Whereas when it comes to venial sins, they're not going to require formal aversion from God as a last from the last end, but the attachment to creatures. That's sort of like the formal, essential, principal difference between the act that we call mortal sin and the act that we call venial sin. But not all authors are going to have that very formal and essential distinction between the two. Sometimes when we talk about mortal sin in a sort of broad sense, in certain ages of the church, they sometimes used mortal sin for simply that which is given eternal punishment. I went over this in an article, I think a few weeks or maybe a few months ago, but there is a way in which we speak about venial sins being mortal sins. And that sounds really weird. But when it comes to those who go to hell, think about it like this. Those who go to hell and, they're reprobate, they ultimately go to hell and they're getting punished in hell. Are they getting punished only for original sin? No, obviously not. Are they getting punished only for mortal sin? Obviously not. They're also getting punished for their venial sins. So when it comes to those in hell, they're getting punished for all the sins they ever committed, whether original or actual, whether mortal or venial. So when it comes to those who die without charity, when it comes to those who die outside of a state of grace, they are eternally punished for their venial sins. It's not like there's some point, unless you're SCOTUS, but that's sort of a different question. It's not like you have some individual who's in hell, who has venial sins, who has the obligation to punishment for these venial sins. It's not like eventually these get remitted. That would be crazy. Remission only comes through Jesus Christ and is only communicated to us by his passion. And when it comes to those individuals in hell, it's not like they're going to have the merits of Christ communicated to them in a small degree just to overcome their venial sins. That would be absolutely ridiculous. So if we only defined mortal sin as that which is punished in hell, or that which in some way we can talk about it meriting, in the case of venial sin per accidents, but meriting eternal punishment, sure, in that sense, we can talk about venial sin as somehow being eternally punished, or we can even talk about it as mortal. But we need to be very careful about that language. We can't stretch that too far. So in this question about concupiscence in unbelievers, this leads us to a very, very interesting question. Because when it comes to concupiscence in unbelievers, this is going to be something, those second first motions, those are going to be, if they die in that state, punished eternally in hell, right? So we can kind of talk about it in terms like that. But we can even come to a more interesting question, and this is going to get us into our teaching on original sin and its relationship to concupiscence. If we just kind of talk about concupiscence in terms of like the intrinsic disorder of the soul that's passed down from Adam to all of those children of Adam outside our Lord and the Blessed Virgin, right? If we just talk about concupiscence in this sense, if we just talk about the inherent or intrinsic disorder that is passed down from father to son and is present even in children as a habitual disorder, like if we're just talking about concupiscence in that sense, is there a way in which we can talk about, the guilt of concupiscence or guilt or the sort of concupiscence with its guilt or, these sort of formulations? Yes, we can actually talk about that. So the reason for this, and St. Thomas, he talks about this in a Quod Libido question in his commentary on Romans, and then in De Malo, and a lot of the Thomists are going to talk about this in detail. And really, this is a very patristic doctrine. This is something which, in my mind, is very clear in the writings of St. Augustine, which I could go over in a different place, different time, different episode. So when it comes to concupiscence in the terms of like an inherent disorder, there's sort of two principles when it comes to the sinfulness of original sin, or the obligation of punishment when it comes to original sin, or the guilt of original sin, if you kind of want to frame it in that way. When it comes to original sin, there is both going to be, on the one hand, the inherent disorder that is present within us. And on the other hand, there is also going to be its attachment with, or its inclusion in Adam. There's going to be an aspect of, voluntarity. There's going to be an aspect of moral union with Adam. That's going to be an aspect of original sin. And on the other hand, the inherent disorder within us, that's also going to be an aspect of original sin. And what's really difficult here is there are theologians who emphasize one or the other aspect to the inclusion of the other. And really, a lot of times we tend to focus on the one rather than the other, but the both need to come together. And really, the Thomistic solution and his reading of St. Augustine, they're very much going to bring these two aspects together. So on the one hand, some overextend the inherent quality or the inherent disorder so much as to make the sole basis of the guilt of original sin this inherent quality that's passed down from parent to child. So what they would say is this sort of inherent quality that is passed down to us to where we are in a like state as Adam, this is the sole and exclusive and adequate basis to where there is inseparably united with this inherent disorder, there is attached the eternal guilt or the damnable guilt that is present on the sole basis of this disorder. Now, there was a lot of difficulties with this and how we are going to relate this to a lot of other doctrines concerning sin and concerning the basis for the guilt of sin and concerning how sin is punished. But basically, that is the impetus of one side of the overextension right there, right? They're going to make the sole and adequate foundation, the inherent quality in the unbaptized, the unregenerate, is going to be that aspect right there. And then on the other hand, there are others, and what they will try to do is they will try to react very harshly against this first crowd, and they will kind of step into the opposite error. So rather than having any sort of role or inclusion for the inherent quality which is passed down, which we can call the fomes peccati, or the tinder of sin, we can call it habitual concupiscence, we can call it just concupiscence, whatever you want. What they will say is well, it's actually this inclusion in Adam that sort of takes the cake, and that is the sole formal adequate aspect of original sin right there, so that what original sin becomes, the guilt of original sin becomes, is it becomes an imputation of Adam's personal sin, an imputation of the guilt that was incurred to us. So on the one hand, we have the aspect of inclusion in Adam, that is going moral union with Adam, or the decrees of God, or however you want to phrase it. On the one hand, there are some that over-exaggerate that aspect of how we talk about the guilt of original sin. And on the other hand, we have this other aspect that is the inherent quality. And the issue with emphasizing the second one, while the first one we can talk about it as, this is silly, ridiculous. There's a lot of, very ridiculous conclusions that we can draw from this, whatever. Talk about that. Really, the second one is more damaging and it's kind of more fundamental in how it corrupts the Catholic doctrine. Because on that first one, what we have is we have the question of, okay, we have somebody who has concupiscence. They have, this has been derived from Adam, habitual concupiscence, this disorder that is present within us. And from this disorder flows all of these motions of concupiscence that just come out. And in some cases, they are mortified by grace. And in this case, it's meritorious. In other cases, they are, permitted. We have that. But this concupiscence is something which is present both in the unregenerate and in the regenerate. So if there was a way in which there was an inseparable aspect of guilt, there was an inseparable aspect of an obligation to eternal punishment with this habitual concupiscence as such, then when it comes to the individual before and after baptism, and before and after the loosing from concupiscence that happens at baptism in the forgiveness of the guilt of concupiscence, and however else you want to phrase it, during this aspect, there is no sort of reason or foundation for before and after the inclusion or non-inclusion of guilt right there. That right there, there's no transition that happens at justification. That's the issue. So that even after justification, there is the inclusion of damnable guilt in somebody. So if you make the sole formal adequate basis for simply the habitual disorder in the soul, or even the habitual disorder with those motions flowing from it, or however else you want to phrase it, if you make that the sole and adequate basis, then you're going to fall into those issues. And hence a lot of the condemnations of the church on these points, I didn't mean to put that in scare quotes, but a lot of the condemnations of the church on this point actually are condemnations of views that would tend to make the sole adequate basis an inherent quality, right? And that would cause a lot of difficulties. But on the other hand, if you make it solely a part of the decree right there, there's sort of no way in which we can explain some sort of union with Adam and actually the loss of gifts and the communication of corruption to the children which come from Adam, right? You need both aspects together. So to unite these aspects is to say that there is a certain, if we consider concupiscence in itself, right? If we just kind of abstract from all considerations and consider merely a habitual inclination, consider just in itself, right? Rather than considering with let's take away consent of the will, let's take away resistance, let's take away all of these aspects, and just consider a habitual inclination. Well, a habitual inclination is not an actual sin. So we're not even talking about the category of mortal or venial sin right there. And then if we talk about the second first motions kind of abstracted in the same way, we can talk about this as somehow being from sin and inclining to sin. And if we kind of add in the consideration of the will, and we speak of this as a non-mortified act, that is, it's just the flesh lusting against the spirit, but the spirit doesn't lust against the flesh so as to mortify it. This is going to be something which is in itself, just considered abstractly, in its sort of bare essence with no sort of attached qualities to it. This is going to be something which is in itself a venial sin, right? But when it comes to reality, in reality, this is not the way in which we are going to talk about original sin. Because, as I've went over before, when it comes to concupiscence is going to have this sort of attachment to original sin, right? It is going to be something which is annexed to original sin. It's going to have its origin in original sin. It's going to have this origin in Adam and in the voluntary act of Adam. It's going to have these attachments and originations and annexations that are going to be present with it. So in a similar way, I'm just making an analogy here, but the way in which this happens metaphysically is slightly distinct. But in a similar way as we talk about, venial sins as being mortal because of the punishment which is per accidens due to it, insofar as it is present in a subject that will never have the remission of venial sin. In a sort of analogous way, When it comes to concupiscence, concupiscence has this attachment to inclusion in Adam. It has this attachment with union in Adam. It has this origination in Adam. And it has this attachment with the decree that joins the individual to Adam. And this decree that joins the individual to Adam is going to be the basis for the culpability of the individual before God. This is important. Both aspects need to be considered, both the inherent quality and the inherent corruption that comes from our first parents, and then also that union, that moral union with Adam that's going to be very much based upon the act of God, right? And this is not in the realm of mortal sin, because mortal sin is an actual sin, a sin of action, if you kind of want to put it like that. It's going to be emotion. But here we're just talking about the inherent habitual corruption that is present, the corruption of concupiscence. So when it comes to these individuals, we can talk about, the damnability of concupiscence. We can talk about the condemnation of concupiscence and the condemnation of the flesh, but it's not going to be this is not going to be a condemnation which is due to a habit. Like, what would that even mean? It's not a condemnation which is due to a first motion of concupiscence. Like, how do we even talk about that? Rather, it is the condemnation which is due to original sin. So it doesn't receive a new condemnation. It receives that exact same condemnation to original sin. So when there is the non-imputation of Adam's sin that happens at the moment of regeneration, when there is the forgiveness and loosening of these bonds that happen with regeneration, there is going to be the removal of the culpability of concupiscence, because it's losing that aspect of moral union with Adam. We're taken from the headship of Adam, we are placed under the headship of Christ. So you can read about, again, this may sound very, very confusing. You may have never heard of this before. And a lot of this is really to explain these kind of down to their principles, down to sort of the foundations. So if you want to read more about this and kind of understand this in more detail, you can check out the article that I released earlier today. The whole thing is for free. I didn't put a paywall or anything on it. I would just ask that you subscribe to the Substack, and if you really enjoy it, become a paid subscriber. Paid subscribers to my Substack are awesome. Or, become a patron at patreon.com/militantomish. That's awesome. If you really want to understand this in a lot more detail, you have to understand the teaching on original sin and the role of moral union with Adam and the ways in which we talk about the imputation of Adam's sin to us, and think about how concupiscence in us, or the inherent disorder within us, is related or has its culpability not from the habit as such, or not from the motion from the faculty as such, from the lower faculties as such, but due to its union, garners its culpability due to the union with its attachment to the imputable sin of Adam. And this is where it garners its aspect of voluntarity, as the later theologians will talk about. Well, I hope this was helpful. I know that this was a lot more dense and a lot more complicated than usual videos, but that's all that I have for you. Remember to like, subscribe, share, and everything like that. Remember to read the article. And as always, God bless.